Gosh, well, thanks very much. It struck me listening to that asking a science fiction writer to talk in any way seriously about the future is kind of like asking an 8-year-old about playground safety design. I'm more interested in making this in making the slides steeper and more slidey, and the roundabouts more centrifugal, and adding ice cream fountains. The thing is that science fiction writers think about the future quite a lot, but they tend to think in very narrow ways, not in a very general way. And the narrow way, the narrow focus is the focus of the book they happen to be writing at the moment. So although they've read a lot about the future, and they spend a lot of time thinking about people who are living in the future, and not necessarily the best people to ask about what the future is going to be like in terms of realism. Nevertheless, it's interesting that if we think about the 5 sort of horsemen of the apocalypse that were mentioned, they've all been anticipated by science fiction sometimes 100 years ago, which is kind of depressing. So the idea that of the problems of the future may always be with us. Overpopulation, for instance, I can think of Harry Harrison's Make Room, perhaps better known as the terrible film Soylent Green. Resource wars, Frank Herbert's Dragon in the Sea from the 1950s. War, almost too many novels to mention, but I suppose nuclear war being the science fiction's big moment when it came to writing about war. So example might be Neville Shutes on the Beach. Class exploitation, you can go back to the Time Machine and think about the Morlocks and the Eloi in H.G. Wells' Time Machine, more than 100 years old. Unsafe technologies, well, that's science fiction's kind of métier, really, because there's nothing science fiction writer likes better than to get a technology and think about how it can go horribly wrong. I don't know, H.G. Wells, again, Food of the Gods, for instance, and many others. So all of these things we've been thinking about in the science fiction field for a long time. And obviously, I think it's because all of these things have been a worry for a long time. You know, overpopulation obviously goes back to Malthus and so on. So that's kind of depressing, isn't it? That the human race has had 100 years to sort out these problems, and they're still with us. And not only that, we've got new problems as well, because one thing that the 21st century has taught us, I think, is that the future isn't going to be at all like we thought it would be. My golden age of science fiction, everybody's golden age of science fiction, is the age 12, just about. It's when you first develop a kind of sense of the world is a bit larger than you. And science fiction delivers that in spades. It's stock in trade, its sense of wonder, shock and awe. So my golden age, the particular locus was in the 1960s, during white heater technology, when we were being told that electricity would be too cheap to meter. And scientists were selling soap powder on the television. And we're going to be promised colour television quite soon. And we're going to have nuclear-powered liners, nuclear-powered spaceships. We're going to have the future that Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey promised. We're going to have Pan Am clippers going up into orbit to space stations. We've got a space station, but it's kind of a small space station. Instead, we don't have air cars and things like that. So quite a lot of the things, when you think about the future, you have to think about quite a lot of the things you think are going to be in the future actually aren't, because they're going to be, by the time it becomes possible to build them, and it is possible to build air cars, people keep coming up with what's going to be the popular air car. There was one a couple of weeks ago, and there'll be one in a couple of weeks' time. There's no need for air cars. I mean, they were very popular in sort of utopian 1920s science fiction, because it was kind of, the motor car was just coming in, and the extension was that everybody would, and the airplane was just coming in, so the confluence was everybody's going to have their own personal kind of little flitter or flivver or helicopter. But it turns out we don't need these things, because we've got wide-bodied 747s instead, and mass tourism. So we get things, we don't get the things we think we're going to get, we get things we didn't quite expect. I think that's one of the big lessons we get. And certainly we get black swan events as well, which nobody predicts. The obvious example of that is 9/11. Nobody predicted that. It changed everything. You could say, well, there was going to be some kind of terrorist spectacular, but nobody knew exactly how large it was going to be and what the repercussions going to be and the ripples that we're still feeling. And one of the interesting things about 9/11, one of the reasons it felt so large was it was on television instantly. It was around the world instantly. It was on the web. Wasn't quite as widespread as it is now, but it was on the web instantly. When it happened, I'd just come back from the States. One of the first things I did when I learned it was going on was to email a friend of mine who lives in West Greenwich Village. So I emailed her and said, what's going on there? Are you okay? And she said, what do you mean, am I okay? Coming straight back. And I said, explain what's happening. She said, oh, that's why my stupid neighbors are standing outside in the street. So, you know, at a distance, I was able to reach back to the stricken city and tell her what was going on, which is a very sort of science fictional moment. So these kind of things, this kind of conflation of the two things, the desire to create a spectacular and the fact that the terrorists knew that there was going to be a stage for the spectacular. There was a global stage. It was global terrorism, something very, very new. Terrorism had been around for 100 years. I mean, the first bombing, the first car bomb, as it was actually a wagon bomb on Wall Street in the 1890s, I think. So that kind of idea had been around for a while, but putting these two things together was kind of a science fictional idea. So these kind of black swans, these kind of confluences are the things we've also got to think about when we're thinking about the future. But if I want to be positive, just end on a positive note, I think one of the things is, as well as being a disruptive, technology can also be enabling, and I think we've seen that in many ways recently. Again, thinking about the web, and looking up here, we've got a Twitter tag. Some of you may be tweeting now. I've been on Twitter a couple of years now, and what's interesting is the thing about Twitter is it's extremely leveling. It's incredibly democratic. You instantly reach out to the person you tweet. They can instantly reply. Other people can pitch in. So you've got this very strange, uncoordinated, and very interesting conversation going on all the time. You dip in it, you dip out. And it's going on 24 hours a day. And obviously when things are happening, if Twitter had been around 9/11, it would have crashed the servers more or less immediately. But the obvious thing about Twitter, and the obvious useful thing that has been going on recently is the Arab Spring. I was able to follow that on Twitter through, finding a couple of people I knew who were getting recommendations for people to follow. And suddenly you're there. You're able to find out what's going on even before the news people who are on the ground are finding out. You're getting eyewitness reports immediately and intimately. The same thing happened with the Japanese tsunami as well. Exactly the same thing. I was getting able to get reports, and many of you were, I expect, as well, get reports instantly on the ground of what was happening, and so on. It links the world together. It does more than that. It actually links people together. It's people using this technology. It's people finding uses for this technology. As William Gibson said, you know, the street finds its own uses for technology, and that was a great example of that. So, sure, technology can be disruptive. Sure, it can be out of control. Sure, it can be used against us by big business. If you're on Facebook, for instance, you are the product of Facebook. If you ever wondered why Facebook is apparently worth so much, and actually it turns out not to be worth so much at all, but was apparently worth so much without any visible product, it's because everybody who was using Facebook was the product. That was the point of Facebook. It's an information harvesting machine. And it's harvesting information from people, and people are willingly giving up all kinds of personal information that 20, 30 years ago nobody had dreamed of doing. So it changes us in very strange ways and very unpredictable ways, and for a science fiction writer, very interesting ways. So the thing I think for some of these solutions, and I'm not a great advocate for solutions, I'm afraid, because as I say, these problems have been around 100 years. It would be immensely arrogant of me to stand here and say, well, I happen to know, with my experience of reading lots of science fiction books, I can now fix the population problem. And unfortunately, some science fiction writers do get a bit carried away and start doing that. But I can say, looking at what's going on with a kind of Martian viewpoint, and having grown up reading science fiction and grown up watching a future die in front of me, the future of the 1960s, the future of 2001, watching that vanish, recede into the rearview mirror, and it began to recede the moment Neil Armstrong put his boot print on the moon. That was it for that future. It was dead, it was gone. I love that future. I still wish it would come about. Some of my fictions are kind of dreams about that future. But it was gone. So again, you can watch futures disappear. But having lived with that and watching new futures come up and watching still more ones just beginning to roll up on the horizon, one thing I can say is that I think we're more alive to the future now than we ever have been, and that's kind of a hopeful thing because as well as sort of looking forward to all these problems, we're beginning to start thinking, well, we really now, instead of just writing stories about them, we ought to actually do something about it. Okay, thanks.
Okay, all right. The future, predicting the future from a science fiction point of view, predicting the future from a political historian's or social economic point of view. Who wants to have a question or a contribution to any of our... oh, who's in charge of the microphone? Where's the microphone person? I'm sure there must be one. It's you, Philip. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, I've got it. You want it? Well, maybe you should go back to the podium, Greg, and then we can do it that way. Are they rationed? We'll have to share this one, you and I. Okay. You stand there together like a little double act, and I'll stay here, and Philip will have the roving mic, and the first question will come from here.
We'll harmonise. Cubate.
Hello, Josh Kuczynski, Central London Humanist Group. I think it's very interesting, the idea of having somebody commenting from the point of view of science fiction. What I want to say is that in some sense, of course, it's all fiction. The future is all fiction. And the question really is, which fiction will in some way relate to reality? And the problem sometimes is, and it's being suggested now, that one of the problems with regards to the economy in Europe is that the fiction is coming adrift because the reality is undermining it. So really, my question would be, what sort of fictional future would we really like to see? And how can we try and engineer a reality that approximates to it?
That's an easy question.
Yeah, that's really easy. Yeah. Do you mean what's the most popular at the moment kind of fiction? I mean, one of the things when you're writing science fiction, let's talk about near future science fiction, which is the most difficult to write and is the most pointless to write in a way because it becomes out of date, again, mostly before you've written it. You have to think of certain things you can't avoid talking about in your fiction. One obvious example would be global warming. You can't write a novel set in the next, say, 20 years ahead without somehow dealing with global warming, okay? So that's a kind of common thing now, and there's an awful lot of dystopian science fiction around at the moment in which global warming accelerated global warming, has had terrible effects and has magnified all the other problems we have at present. So that's one. And it's very difficult to get around global warming because it's very difficult to think of a quick fix for global warming. I mean, basically what we're doing is we're terraforming the planet. We used to think it'd be great to terraform Mars and make it habitable for human life. Instead, we're terraforming Earth making it uninhabitable for human life. There are various, I mean, obviously there are various technological fixes for that. So you can think of a happy technological future in which all of the big projects to do fast fixes for global warming could work. This might be an example, yeah? So, you know, you've got nice, on the lawn out there, instead of the Olympic sign, you've got a big shiny ball. Inside that big shiny ball is solid carbon dioxide that we've extracted from the atmosphere to keep the carbon dioxide level down. We've got mirrors in space to cut the sunlight down. We've got robot clipper ships plying the oceans, pumping out aerosols of sulfur dioxide to make more rain clouds in the right places. Okay, I know a lot of you had trouble getting here yesterday. So experiencing global warming at first hand via the first Great Western. So all of those things might happen. That's a shiny, happy thing. But what's interesting about science fiction at the moment is there are very few shiny, happy futures. There are very few technological futures because they realize, people are realizing that for every sort of fix that technology provides, it also provides problems as well. I mean, you know, it's great having all these jets, but it's a bit unfortunate when somebody decides to turn them into a weapon, and so on and so forth. So it's, at the moment, sort of the nice, happy futures, again, because of my age, I'll refer back to 2001, that kind of thing, where there seemed to be no problems. There wasn't a world government, but there was a kind of rapprochement between the Americans and Russians and so on, with foothold in space, blah, blah. That kind of thing is seen as very old hat now. It's kind of what people have been called me-took futures are the in thing, where everything is more or less exactly as it is now. There's overpopulation, there's global warming, there's competition for resources, there's increasing division between the rich and the poor. So the sort of futures we don't want are the futures which are exactly the same as the present, where nothing has been done. But it's difficult to come up with convincing arguments at the moment, which is a bit of a worrying thing about exactly how we'd get these fixes in. And again, it's not technology, it's thinking, new ways of thinking, perhaps. Yeah. Coming back to the talk earlier,
I think that there's no reason to presume that we can't solve the problems we face, firstly. Secondly, there's also no reason to presume that the problems we now face are not going to get worse. Are you all gambling people? I mean, take your choice here. It's not that the problems are insoluble. If I'd had another 20 minutes or so, I would have posed for you a utopian vision of the future, in which we first of all recognize the severity of the circumstances we're in, secondly, set out to persuade everybody else that it's a good idea to solve the problems, and then thirdly, go ahead and embark on the solution. It's not that it can't be done. It can be done, but I don't see it being done.
Greg, are there any parallels from the past, not just of big mass movements that try to correct present-day injustice, like we were hearing about slavery, but of any sort of mass movements that try to sort of make explicitly creating a better future, sort of taking a very negative possible future that they projected and then set about to improve that future? Is there any examples in history of that?
The past is full of such examples.
Oh, right.
The most important of all is the greatest utopian experiment of all times, of course, communism, in its modern form, but it has many historical predecessors. The Marxian experiment, as you all know, starts in the early decades of the 19th century, rises to an apogee with the Bolshevik Revolution, comes, some would say, crashing to the ground in 1991. On the other hand, what's the second most powerful economy in the world? Belongs to a communist country, doesn't. Whether the idea itself is bankrupt, communism, but some of the content of it, that's to say, managing our resources collectively in common with a goal to ensuring the survival of the whole species, that is a content I think you can wrench out of that context. The term itself, along with Marxism and so on, I think is difficult to rewarm and resell now.
Yes. Hand up if you've got a question so I can answer things accordingly. Yes, there, and then now. Anyone over here?
Tricia Rogers, thank you for your provoking presentations. I was interested in your using the internet as, and 9/11 as examples of us all knowing instantly what was happening. Because I remember back, I was living in Nigeria at the end of the 60s, way before the internet, and there was a civil war on my doorstep. And every night people would get together at 10 o'clock to listen to the BBC World Service to hear what was happening down the road. A few years later, I was in Pakistan when there was a bit of an uprising and Bhutto was being executed again. It was World Service and other radio. So I think ever since the invention of radio, which is, you know, early 19th century technology, we have had this ability to know what's happening all over the world and nearby. Of course, there need to be people there telling us. And in fact, I have the opposite problem now because there is, I just want to make another point. I think one of the things about the internet is it's more democratic, so that, you know, the poorer groups, for example, when I was involved with the Tibet issue, the Tibetan government in exile could get access to a website as cheaply as the People's Republic of China. So it did enable them both to get out their propaganda, you know, in a way that perhaps was harder when it all had to be printed and distributed and you needed lots of money. But now I just feel completely overwhelmed. You know, if I follow Twitter, if I follow Facebook, if I follow all these things, how is there time in the day we are all being so bombarded with communication and opinions and information, and yet we still have, you know, comparable brain power to our parents and grandparents, great-grandparents. I don't know how people process all this information and how you do the selection. I preferred having something like the BBC World Service to do it for me.
Well, precisely, it's a filter problem, and your chosen filter is the BBC World Service. Nothing wrong with that. My chosen filter are several people I trust to follow on Twitter, and the people they follow, and so on. It's kind of a network of wisdoms. And yes, it's true. I mean, information overload is a big problem. Again, you know, this was mentioned science fiction getting it right. I could be here all day, science fiction getting it wrong, but John Brunner, an English science fiction writer, wrote several novels in the late 1960s, early 1970s about exactly this problem. Stand on Zanzibar was a kind of a novel, portmanteau novel in a way, which put in problems like overpopulation, like micro-wars going on around the world, but also, you know, in communication, in information and filtration, and who do you trust? Who exactly is behind that hashtag. You know, celebrities actually have to double identify themselves as the actual celebrity, and there are plenty of fake celebrities. You know, I suppose Mrs. Stephen Fry is pretty well known. You know, we all know Mrs. Stephen Fry is not Mrs. Stephen Fry, but we go along with the fiction. And it's kind of interesting, you know, but that causes problems. You know, if you start fictionalizing facts as they're happening. And yeah, you can get, I mean, when the Libya thing was going on, I got a tweet saying that Colonel Gaddafi had been killed in the Libyan TV studios. And but that died down after 5 minutes. Somebody came on and stomped all over it, and then somebody else came on and affirmed the stomping, as it were. So these things rise up and die down. So what you're seeing is yeah, you are seeing this unfiltered thing. But what's more interesting about it is you're carrying it with you. You know, you've got this communication device in your pocket, you've got the mobile phone, or you've got your netbook, or whatever you've got, you know, your iPad. So it's everywhere. And your point about, you know, the Tibetans being able to communicate instantly, that is the power of it. That is, you know, anybody can set up a site to do anything. Somebody after the tsunami set up a site which became a book. To help the charity, you know, and that was done entirely through, I think, mostly through Twitter to begin with as well, recruiting people who then sent stuff in, and then this book was printed and sold electronically. You know, it's just like a spontaneous generation thing in a way. Somebody had an idea, but the technology enabled it to happen, and that's one of the powerful things, I think, that can be harnessed in that way. Turn it around and be hopeful, technology helping. But it's not the big technologies we used to think that were, you know, going to be the solution. You know, like the Thunderbirds in my childhood. You know, international rescue with their big machines coming in to save other big machines. Future ain't like that. But international rescue would be the baddie because they were saving all the atomic Brazilian forest stripping machines and things like that. So yeah.
Okay. Mike Gower, Bristol. I shouldn't think there's a single person here who would not want to continue to support UNESCO, ActionAid, all these different groups that are saving children's lives, mostly in what we call the developing world. It is the only humane thing to do. And yet, of course, we are exacerbating the problem. And this is our horrible dilemma. Because the more children that survive, the more mouths to feed. In their particular cultures, as was in our culture 100 years or more ago, the normal thing is to have as many children as you can or as happen. And there are a lot of religions and cultures which reinforce this. This is our problem. We are adding, are we only adding, pushing off a worse and worse day in terms of rapidly increasing population, overpopulation? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very old problem, and thanks for raising it. Does charity and philanthropy simply exacerbate the problem, and shouldn't we just let nature, so to speak, as if there were such a thing, follow its course? I agree entirely. I mean, I would not want to try to desist from such efforts in the least. The problem lies in the creating of new children, as you say, the second stage of your statement, not in saving the lives, not in eradicating malaria, smallpox, so on and so forth. The problems can be addressed only, I think, from the center and at the level of world organization, whether that's the United Nations or some successor organization which is much more powerful in turn. You have to be able, in the first instance, as you rightly point out, to provide people some compensation for the lack of children they would otherwise have bred to support themselves in old age. If you don't do that, you will never stop them from having as many children as they require and as their circumstances dictate. So that requires a redistributive mechanism from the wealthier countries to the poorer. It would require, this has been toyed with, of course, by the Indians, the Chinese, and various other peoples. It would require a mechanism by which you at some point offer carrots for people to, incentives to have smaller families, but without the additional compensation of care in illness and old age and so on, it's not going to work.
Stephen Collinson from Bedfordshire. Supposing Polly was successful and ecocide became law, and I think most of us would understand that simply the numbers of humans about in any country would be a major factor in that. Could you vision a future where countries were being sued by simply not controlling the numbers of their populations?
Arthur Throwfall from West Glamorgan Humanist Group. A couple of things. One is our colleague from Central London talked about reality undermining fiction. My big worry is that fiction is undermining reality in the context of all the lunatic stuff we get on the internet. And not only that, but all these creationists in America who are working hard for the rapture and trying to create an ecological breakdown so that they get the second coming earlier. But it strikes me that the only solution with the internet is the abolition of anonymity. And if we could only have open society if people are prepared to put their name to anything they want to say. And all this other stuff about Mrs. Fry, it doesn't matter if it's called Mrs. Fry, as long as we know it's Joe Bloggs, that's fine. But we want to have anonymity. You go onto websites, say The Guardian or something like that, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and there are about 500 comments bullying Polly Toynbee, for instance. Completely, utterly ridiculous. And we don't know who they are.
Shall
I see
do
we
you want to
belong
take
to the same church anyway. I'm glad.
Do you want to say anything about anonymity?
Well, yeah, let me take
Yeah,
the
do you
first
want to do
question
that? No,
first,
I've
and
got
then we
something
move
to
on.
say as well, yeah.
Just very briefly, the issue about countries suing other countries. Why not? It's an intriguing idea. It requires a collective agreement in the first instance. I mean, this is what we are very, very far from yet, that we wish to control our populations, and countries which are sufficiently successful at so doing should surely be rewarded in due course, just as people who succeed in keeping their family sizes down should be rewarded through taxation mechanisms, which enable them to have perhaps 2, 3 children, but tax them punitively after that. There's no reason why the individual and the national systems can't be writ large in an international system. But we're a very long ways off from agreeing anything like this. So.
Yeah. Well, get back to population. I mean, one of the things I think with the population is there's a line in the movie The Jerk. It's a Steve Martin movie. I don't know if you know it. He invents a pair of glasses. He's an idiot, but he invents a pair of glasses with a little grab there. You take them off very quickly. Turns out that makes you cross eyes. He becomes rich, and then he loses all his money. And his girlfriend, she maybe even his wife, can't quite remember, says, you know, when he loses all, it's not the money, it's the stuff. And I think that's what we're mostly worried about in the West. It's not the money, it's all our stuff. We're worried about not having as much stuff in the future as we used to have. In other words, there's going to be a leveling down. And I think until there is actually a leveling down, we can't really stand around and tell other people what to do. It's kind of, you know, we see this with the carbon trading thing. The African countries say, now wait a minute, America's setting the agenda here. America is, you know, evil when it comes to using carbon. I mean, an American is the equivalent of a Nigerian village. So who are you to preach to us? It becomes a really big problem. You can't really assume the moral high ground until you actually earn the moral high ground. And that's very difficult to sort out. So yeah, it'd be a great idea if we had some kind of regulatory police force who would come in and tell countries when they were going wrong. But unfortunately, at the moment, we don't. We have force majeure. And we've seen, you know, how well that doesn't work when that's been applied in Iraq. You know, best intentions, maybe, if you accept that, but terrible consequences nevertheless. So I feel there are big problems with that. As for anonymity, I think it's partly the same thing. It's fine to unmask Mrs. Stephen Fry, but it's not so fine to unmask somebody who's blogging about, for instance, Syria at the moment, from Syria. And yes, it leads to problems because we had an instance of a journalist in Edinburgh pretending to be a Syrian activist, a woman. So, you know, assuming false identities. And that caused all sorts of problems, not the least for some Syrians, actually, who sided with her and then were arrested. So there are problems with it, I agree. But you have to think, do the problems, you know, does the solution again create other problems? And I think certainly there's a lot of bullying going on, and that's to be condoned. But, you know, bullying Polly Toynbee or Fern Cotton, another example at the moment, is small potatoes compared with Chinese internet activists being arrested and their families followed around by thugs. So again, you know, we've got to be very careful of applying Western solutions to countries which have non-Western problems.
Okay, our last three comments on the floor here, there, yeah.
Bob Booth, it's part of our Western culture to expect and consume too much. We have no right to say that people in the third world shouldn't have more cars, more televisions, and so on. In what practical way do we, or can we, stop that?
Jenny Bartle. So if you were both given one policy that you were allowed to introduce in, say Europe, apart from possibly the introduction of ecocide, because we've already had all about that, what policy would you say would be the most important, influential thing to introduce?
I confess that I am horrified with this almost unanimous acceptance that the problem with the destruction of the planet comes from the overpopulation of the world. If I'm not wrong, 25% of the most privileged people in the world, i.e. us, the rich countries and rich middle classes all over the world, consume around 70% of the world resources. I absolutely oppose this idea of reducing the world population. Is that let's reduce the consume by the rich.
Golly. I just said you can't do it, you know. Just don't ask a science fiction writer to do it. They'll come up with a stupid answer like, oh, I don't know, let's ban private ownership of cars. You know, why not? That would solve a lot of problems. I'm trying to think of something that would be more sensible and less contentious, but I can't actually. So that would do it. But this comes from pure selfishness. I live in London. I gave my car up years ago because I got fed up with having it fixed and then realizing I didn't need it. But I live in a big city. So again, selfish, but anyway.
Just one?
Yeah.
Okay. I would change the tax system vis-a-vis children to give a premium to people who don't have children, who have only one child. Stop after 2 children, offering substantial state support at all, and after 3, begin to have a punitive tax structure. The trick with this is that it cannot be unfair to the poor, because the wealthy, of course, as we know from the Chinese example, buy their way out of punitive taxes of this kind. So you'd have to get around that, and I readily admit it is a very difficult problem. But that, if I'm only allowed one law, there it is.